brief discussion for a moment of the relevance. Well, not the relevance, but yeah, I think I called it relevance on the discussion board that we just did. I think discussion board 11 or something like that, where we were talking about All the Family and some of these other shows. Just one thing to note: over the last couple of days, I was watching a ton of old Tonight Show stuff on YouTube, and a lot of old Don Rickles from the Tonight Show and from the 1970s Dean Martin roasts, where Dean was kind of sitting there with a drink and a cigarette constantly, and doing that whole Dean Martin mode of you know being semi engaged in what this was. But what would happen is, like, on the dais, you'd have different people there, and you would have a pretty diverse group of people. And Rickles would come up and he would tear into them. And Rickles' whole career it basically got started by a act that he did that he became like this performer that people always kind of wanted to come and see, including like the big performers themselves. You had to go see Rickles, because what Rickles would do is he was just basically, he had basic stock lines, but he would apply them to people that he would see and just tear them apart. I mean, like a kind one, would be something like, what's your name? Tom. Okay, Tom Smith. Okay, and then it suddenly turns. What are you doing here, Tom? Nobody wants you here. Get out of the room. I mean, that was the kind of stuff that Rickles did. But the stuff that we know for what Rickles did really were some of the things that were kind of like Archie Bunker lines. He would nothing was sacred. He was Jewish himself, so he would talk about Jews, but he would also talk about Italians and use various stereotypes. He would talk about the Irish and use various stereotypes, African Americans, and use various stereotypes. And I think that this gets to the same sort of thing in some ways of what All in the Family and what a lot of like shows like, what, try and find some episodes of Match Game from the 1970s and see the kind of things that they were doing. But I think what they really felt at this time was that the people who were in on this and in this sort of demographic switch, and this switch where you know everyone was more sophisticated and more urbane and got this, was kind of like this sort of beyond color, beyond race, is sort of like this sort of I know we'd heard a lot of things in terms of a post-racial society after 2008, but this is kind of like the early television post-racial society, where television had suddenly, after being devoid of African Americans for so many years, except in very stereotypical roles, suddenly was embracing African Americans. It's like if you saw the Sammy visit in that episode, right? And Sammy Davis says, "See, this year we're in." That kind of hints at this, and there were lots of articles about African Americans in television in TV Guide in the late '60s and early '70s that one was seeing, and I think what it was the fact that, because this can be said, whether it's Norman Lear saying it through Archie Bunker and disarming it, or whether it's Don Rickles coming up and saying the most outlandish, really horrible things, that at the time was standard fare on NBC, or NBC most of the time, where Rickles appeared, but Rickles appeared on other things. This was kind of standard fare, and I think that the idea at that time, and it's kind of hard to understand, is that the way that we at the time thought that one could show how they had risen above race was to be able to say these jokes and expose them for how stupid they were. It's one thing Rickles was never doing jokes necessarily that were stereotypes. He was doing the joke was really that Rickles, at least I think this, I could be wrong and I may be interpreting it wrong, but the thing is that because Rickles is saying this, he's in on the stereotype. He knows that it's a stereotype because it's the character he's playing. Because in real life, he's not this guy. And at the end of his act, he's always this really, not all the time, but if you watch him enough, and I watched like 4 or 5 hours of him a day, if you watch him enough, he's like this like real effusive, like Johnny, you helped my family, you gave me my first break, Johnny, and I'll love you forever for this, and this I want to do, or whoever he's doing, there's always this really nice thing at the end, and I think that in reality that's who Don Rickles really was. Don Rickles was not that guy, but by extending this act to making fun of just Tom Smith in the audience, and then adding that sort of exposition of that stereotype, it was a very interesting thing in that it was believed to be diffusing those stereotypes. But watch the reaction that Rickles gets on the dais, and if you get a chance to see any of these things where Rickles is doing the roast, and you see his segment, watch the difference in the reaction that you'll see very often from African Americans who are hearing this, and know that Don Rickles doesn't mean what he is saying, but is saying it as part of that comedy. But watch that, and then watch the reaction uh, white people who are on the dais. And usually the white person's reaction is just this uproarious laughter, which you would think would be the opposite thing. You'd think it would be uncomfortable, but and a lot of times the African American response is kind of like, "What did you just say?" Sort of thing. And it's very interesting to see that difference. So I don't think um, that that just by using this sort of stereotypical stuff to disarm the stereotypical stuff could truly disarm it, when you still had to be affected by it. Because when you didn't have the thing of being there on the dais, right, at the time, and knowing it's just Rickles, you were subjected to it for the rest of your life. And so these are very different things, and I think these reaction were, but I think that primarily the sophisticated urban white producer, comic performer at the time felt that by doing that, one would reach this post-racial thing that we've laughed at it, and now we don't have to deal with it anymore. By laughing at it, we are disarming it, but it's way, way, way more complicated than that. It's way more complicated than that, and I think that you can start to see at the time, when I'm watching this as a kid, it's Rickles going up there and doing these things, and you were watching, how crazy would he get. But it's very different watching it now. It's very different thinking that this is the era that people in my age group grew up in. And again, at the time, it had this effect on me to make myself believe that there was sort of this post-racial period in American culture, and that this was getting beyond those things. But at the same time, I knew that I wasn't going to repeat Rickles' routine in public. You weren't going to do that. That was reserved. That was his thing that he was doing, and it was never really 100% comfortable. And like I said, you know what? Just to even watch him on Johnny Carson and Ed McMahon. One of the bits that he loved doing with Johnny and Ed was Ed was the sidekick for Johnny Carson, and he would always say, "Yeah, okay, Ed, tell Johnny what you told me, behind stage, that you can't stand him, that you really want to get out of the show." I mean, this was that kind of thing that was starting in there. He would pick on their wives, and you could tell they would laugh And they had him back as a guest and all that stuff, but at the same time, they were very, very uncomfortable moments. It was kind of weird. It was almost I don't know if this was true or not, but I could almost see myself as I was watching these things, thinking Ed McMahon must hate it when Rickles is on. Um, and it's interesting though to see that. But the reason that I'm talking about all of this is because looking at this '70s era, I get what they thought they were doing, and I think that they had their hearts in the right place. But again, like so many things that we do to this day, um, the execution of it is not always following in the way that the heart wants to follow. So yeah, I don't know if you get this or if it's just something that you had to live through. But if you watch these things, because this is part, well, okay, why am I talking about this? This is part of television history. This was a big part of television history. People my age grew up with this sort of stuff. And in my case, it made me someone who I believe had more sensitivity to these issues. I'd like to think of myself in that way. I don't know what it did for other people. I mean, I think I got it, but I don't know whether other people got it. And I think that this TV from this time was very complex, very, very complex, and very hard to tear apart. At the time, it didn't seem so at all. It seemed like such a simple thing for them at the time. The answer seemed so simple. This is what you do, and this is how we deal with it. And I think we've gotten much more nuanced, and maybe that's the difference. Knowing what the nuances are today, and just seeing at the beginning of this how people were so clumsy or not clumsy with just blurting out what they thought from their heart would transfer into a positive change. I think they wanted the positive change. I have absolutely no doubt they wanted the positive change. But then they were also at Rickles, um, also trading in those stereotypes. Okay, bringing up stuff that maybe hadn't been brought up. Same thing that Archie Bunker character was accused of. Ah, gosh, he's saying things that we kind of thought we weren't going to be saying anymore. So anyway, very complicated time, and TV is a big part of that, and a really big part. But I think it is at a time. Now here's the interesting thing: at a time where people were willing to engage a racial discussion. I don't think they did it necessarily in a way that we would find productive at this time, but there was an incredible willingness to engage this issue, whether it was entertainment, whether it was in a comedy, I mean, or more drama, or whether it's Rickles on there. It was a direct engagement of this, and that's something that's very meaningful in terms of television. So, all right.